The majority of House Republicans, amazingly, just aligned with the Biden administration on one of its top priorities to ban the social media app TikTok. This amounts to the most far-reaching act of censorship in the history of the United States. It's an attack on the right of American citizens to receive their information from any source they choose. Most of us believe that was a fundamental right. But of course, almost no one in Washington will admit that that's happening. That's not at all what's going on, they tell us. No. Instead, they're framing what's very obviously censorship as an act of self-defense against a foreign adversary. And if that sounds familiar, it should be. It's the same rationale they used to spy on Donald Trump, among other things, once they designated him a tool of Russia. And as always, they're doing all of this in the bluntest, least restrained terms, because it's your fault, actually. Quote, voting against the bill is a vote for the Chinese Communist Party, proclaimed neocon Congressman Dan Crenshaw, the Nikki Haley of Texas. Quote, the opponents of this bill aren't defending free speech, they're defending Chinese access to American data and American minds. Not a good look. You're a bad American if you don't agree with me, says Dan Crenshaw. And the rest of the liars said similar things, and maybe some of them believed it. That is possible, given the median IQ in the Congress. But just for a moment, let's consider their argument rationally. Let's just assess it for a moment. The federal government very much wants to protect us and our children from China. That's what they're telling us. Now let's assume for a moment that that's true. And let's further assume that the Chinese government is in fact a greater threat to our happiness and well-being than our own government is. That's a stretch if you think about it. In fact, it's totally unsupported by evidence of any kind. But for the sake of argument, let's just stipulate that that is in fact true. So if you were in charge, how would you go about protecting the United States from China? Let's see. The first thing you would do is prevent the CCP from buying American farmland and controlling our food supply. That way, the Chinese government, a government they claim is our greatest enemy, would not have the power to starve our population to death. That would be key. You get right on that. Of course, you'd also want to make sure that the CCP had zero control over our water, or energy, or communications infrastructure, basic, elemental things, things you couldn't live without. You wouldn't want the Chinese anywhere near those things. You would not allow it. Those would be the first priorities on your list. And then you would make certain that the Chinese didn't control your economy. You would not, for example, export your entire industrial base to China, simultaneously making them rich and you poor. You would not do that. Nor would you allow them to hold a meaningful portion of your debt. That would be reckless as hell. You wouldn't allow the Communist Party of China to send billions to your most prestigious universities, thereby gaining control of the minds of the next generation of your leaders. And needless to say, you would not allow Chinese citizens by the tens of thousands to invade your country over your southern border. That would be insane. You would furthermore keep Chinese citizens out of medical, scientific, and R&D facilities. You definitely would not fund their biolabs or cover up for them when they unleashed killer viruses on the world. No, you wouldn't. Why would you do that? And then on questions of foreign policy, you would not spend a ton of time worrying about Taiwan. It's far away, and honestly, who cares? No. Because you don't have all the money in the world or all the time in the world, you would narrow down your priorities, and you would spend your energy and military might on your own hemisphere, where you and your population actually live. The people you want to protect, they live in the Western Hemisphere. So you would not allow the Chinese government to colonize pretty much every country in the Americas, including Canada and Mexico. No. And you certainly wouldn't let the Chinese, of all people, build the infrastructure in places that you directly control, like the supposedly American Virgin Islands, where the roads are paid for by China. That would be crazy and humiliating and very easy to stop. You wouldn't have to put up with that, so you wouldn't put up with it. Not for a second. And just to make sure that China understood you're doing all you could to protect your own people, because that was really your goal, because being Dan Crenshaw, you really care about your own people and your own country. Because of that, you would immediately shoot down any spy balloon from China that floated over Montana. Obviously, that's some of what you would do. And yet, somehow, the US government, even Dan Crenshaw, who really cares about your children, protecting them from China, has done none of that, and has no plans to do any of that ever. So China still makes our antibiotics and our vitamins. But what Dan Crenshaw is doing is banning a social media app. And probably not the first social media app Dan Crenshaw will call for banning, or the Biden administration, with the help of Republican leaders, will try to ban. So what is this about? Well, it's not about China. It may be about other foreign countries. It's definitely not about China, because pay no attention to what they say. Watch carefully what they do.
Influence operations, data collection, even geolocation efforts, algorithms. that suppress certain views and inflate others. How can any American in any position of power not move immediately to force this 100% sale of the company TikTok from the communist Chinese? How's there anyone against this?
Because TikTok's popular. People like it. And the reason why they like it, what makes TikTok so good, is that it has this artificial intelligence that knows you better than you know yourself. It's literally reading your mind. The more you use it, the more it knows about you. The problem is not that TikTok has that. The problem is that ByteDance and their engineers in China are the ones that own that artificial intelligence. And so as long as ByteDance owns the artificial intelligence that powers TikTok, we got a Trojan horse living inside our country. Their parent company is under the complete control, period, of a foreign government that's hostile to the United States.
Now, it's been said that China's relationship with the United States will be one of the defining factors of the 21st century. Relations between the two superpowers have been strained in recent years over a host of issues, including trade, human rights, spying allegations, and Taiwan.
China, Russia and Iran are holding joint naval exercises this week near the Gulf of Oman.
Well, during much of the Cold War, Soviet Russia and Communist China were at odds, but especially since the start of the Ukraine war, the two authoritarian neighbours have been forging deeper ties and now appear to be positioning themselves as geopolitical counterweights to the US.
As the title of our discussion implies, today's global order is not working for everyone. In fact, I would go further and say it's not working for anyone.
So vital is China to Moscow now that the President Vladimir Putin has described Beijing and Russia's relationship as being without borders.
Китая непосредственно. Мы готовы кооперироваться во всех областях. У нас нет никаких...
As for China itself, we are ready to cooperate in all areas. We don't have any restrictions. This also applies to military technology. As we think about the future world order, about ensuring our security.
The Philippines has accused China of stirring up trouble in the South China Sea. That's after Chinese vessels fired a water cannon at one Philippine ship and collided with another in some of the world's most contested waters.
Chinese ships were trying to block a supply mission to the second Thomas Shoal, a reef occupied by the Philippines that China claims as its own, along with most of the South China Sea.
The Chinese Coast Guard conducted provocative, unilateral, illegal, and unprofessional acts that is conduct unbecoming of a Coast Guard officer.
China's Coast Guard fleet is now the largest in the world, and analysts say altercations like this show it's taking on a more aggressive role in pursuing Beijing's maritime interests. It recently ramped up patrols around the Taiwanese islands of Jinmen, territory within eyeshot of the Chinese mainland, which Beijing views as its own. But all that stoking fears maritime spats could spiral into great power conflict involving the United States. The US is Taiwan's most important ally and arms provider, and Manila has a mutual defense treaty with Washington.
With no path to de-escalation in sight, some of the world's most contested waters may see more tension and more potential for miscalculation in the weeks and months to come.
Let's focus on Russia. President Vladimir Putin says Moscow ready for nuclear war if threatened.
Putin's latest warning to the West as some NATO nations like France and Poland refuse to rule out sending troops to Ukraine.
The 2024 annual threat assessment of U.S. intelligence is warning the U.S. is facing, quote, an increasingly fragile global order this year. The report also says that, quote, ambitious but anxious China, a confrontational Russia, some regional powers such as Iran, and some more capable non-state actors are challenging long-standing rules of the international system as well as U.S. primacy within it.
Now, Iran in recent years has in fact stepped up its military cooperation with Russia and China as its ties with the United States remain pretty strained.
Against the backdrop of rising armed conflict in the Red Sea, it is the second time that China has conducted joint drills in the Indian Ocean since the outbreak of Israel-Hamas war. China has warships stationed at a naval base in Djibouti near the Red Sea. It has not officially condemned the Houthi attacks.
The naval forces of the Yemeni armed forces, with the help of Allah the Almighty, carried out a targeting operation against the American ship Pinocchio in the Red Sea with a number of appropriate naval missiles, and the hit was accurate.
The Houthi leader previously pledged that attacks will escalate if what he calls the brutal aggression against Gaza does not stop.
I mean, it underscores the fact that the United States is facing global security challenges on a scale we certainly haven't seen since the Cold War, and most likely, since World War II. I mean, just look at the facts of it. Our adversaries are considerably more aggressive. Russia invaded Ukraine with the objective of expanding into NATO and trying to break the NATO alliance, which obviously would mean a major war in Europe. We got Iran, who's operationalized all of their proxies with two stated objectives: to drive the United States out of the Middle East region and to destroy the state of Israel. And they are about that every single day, and we don't even talk about Iran. And then we have China, who's obviously very aggressive, attempting to dominate the Indo-Pacific region, replace the United States as the world's global leader. How do we know that? Because they talk about it all the time. And also, all of these countries are undermining the civil society in the United States. China is conducting aggressive cyber espionage on a regular basis. Russia has huge influence operations that are ongoing as we speak, and Iran is stepping up their game as well. I mean, the United States is clearly under attack here in our homeland and also in all of our interests overseas. And where was a discussion of this in the State of the Union?
And the House has voted to pass a bipartisan bill that could lead to a nationwide ban of TikTok.
And Diane, to set this into context, this is really just the latest shoe to drop in the broader U.S.-China technology Cold War, the effort to try and split off sensitive technologies from each other. The U.S. has banned giant Huawei telecommunications firm from the United States, but to move into the arena of apps and software behind export controls on chips and telecommunications, that would have a sweeping effect because there are many Chinese companies that are influential in the software space in the United States.
It's our adversary, our most powerful adversary. And we're just giving them all this information because they got some well-heeled lobbyists on Capitol Hill.
Our world is facing existential challenges, but the global community is more fragmented and divided than at any time during the past 75 years. Even the Cold War era was, in some ways, less dangerous. A global order that works for everyone must address these gaps and provide solutions. Excellencies, if countries fulfill their obligations under the UN Charter and international law, every person on earth would live in peace and dignity. Excellencies, it is clear that our world is in deep trouble. Global governance in its present form is entrenching divisions and fueling discontent. We must work based on justice with renewed urgency and solidarity. There is always an opportunity to create a more inclusive, comprehensive and effective global order that works for everyone based on international law. A safer world and a bigger pie for all. That is the objective of the UN Summit of the Future in September. Let's seize the opportunity, and I thank you.